Welcome, everybody. Today we have a special guest from Texas in the US, Elaine Carrick from Optima Mergers and Acquisitions. He is the founder and managing director. He also is a very special co-host of the Deal Table podcast, which I thoroughly recommend that you get onto. A lot of effort goes into that. There is some great detail in that. Now, Lane has over 30 years experience buying, selling, building businesses, and his speciality is bridging the gap between sophisticated institutional buyers and business owners. So he is the perfect candidate for our podcast today. So welcome, Lane, to have you on board.
Hey, Craig. Great to be here. I appreciate you having me on the show. Another Texan, one of the many Texans that have migrated to your show.
It is absolutely true. I was just saying before that I believe that the whole of America lives in Texas at this stage.
It seems
But
like
you're not in Texas right now because you're doing something special. You're out visiting grandkids, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Our first grandchild arrived about 3 weeks ago. My namesake, another Lane in the world. So I'm not sure I'm up to that task, but here we are. We're in Colorado where it's cooler than it is in Texas. If everybody lives in Texas now, half of them leave in the summer to go to Colorado for cooler temperatures. So I happen to be part of that group, although for different reasons.
Oh, congratulations on that. Now, we've caught up a couple of times before, and you're, 30 years in the industry. Your experience is quite incredible, and what you have achieved in that time frame. Now, your speciality is the 10 to 100 million these days marketplace. Why that range, and what is the difference between that range, the lower market, and the higher market above for people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've bought and sold businesses personally, as you know from our discussions, but my role as an intermediary representing sellers to buyers is relatively new. I started it about 5 years ago, drawing upon the experience I have for myself, both buying and selling businesses on my own, as well as running an advisory firm for ultra high net worth families, a lot of whom had operating businesses. In my experience in M&A, consulting a business brokerage firm and then a large M&A shop in Dallas, was that the market's really bifurcated, maybe trifurcated. I'm not sure that's a word, but for businesses with enterprise values, I'll just say from 7 million and down, those are typically, there are exceptions, sophisticated buyers in the ways of buying a business. They may be business people, but they haven't bought a business. They don't know what they don't know. A seller who may be unsophisticated, may be great at making widgets, but doesn't understand how to sell their business. It's probably the biggest transaction of their life, monetizing the value of that business. And the buyer is going to be dependent typically upon Small Business Administration loan to fund the purchase. And so the way those deals get done, where there's a lot of hand-holding between the buyers and the sellers, with a financing arm from the SBA, the percentage of deals that close is remarkably small, Craig. The industry estimates are around 20%. Which, to look at that from a different angle, that means 8 out of 10 business owners that go to market in those small businesses don't get a transaction. And that's a pretty damning statistic. So there's a lot of noise in those transactions.
I want to go back to that one and find out more about it.
Yeah, and there are reasons for that are beyond maybe the obvious. It's a very noisy marketplace, and deals are hard to get done. And so I've worked a number of deals in that space and had relative success with it, but it was very, very difficult and very time consuming to work those deals. And then I had the pleasure of working some larger deals, and the equation changed. Now, when I say larger, that's that 10 to 100 million. So once I got above the individual borrowing money from the bank to buy a single business from the seller, my sellers changed. They were running larger businesses just by virtue of having a business valued at 10 to 100 million. They tend to have better books and records. They tend to be less owner dependent. They tend to have systems and processes. They tend to have less customer concentration, all those things that create so many challenges for the smaller businesses. They still are relatively unsophisticated. Even a business owner with a $50 million business may never have done a transaction, buying or selling a business, so they don't know what they don't know. But the buyer becomes sophisticated. The buyer of that $10 to $100 million business is typically private equity or a family office. And they're very sophisticated. They may look at hundreds, even thousands of deals a year. They're going to bring in a team of accountants to do a quality of earnings analysis. They're going to bring in a team of attorneys to do intense legal due diligence. Now they're bringing in cybersecurity experts to do cybersecurity evaluations. They're going to have insurance specialists looking at, the coverage for the company. So now I've got a relatively unsophisticated seller in the way of selling a business matched up against a very sophisticated buyer. So creates a great opportunity for me to bridge that gap. I've used the analogy that, for sellers that aren't well represented, they're coming to a gunfight with a knife. They're just outmanned. And so you can get some really lopsided results. So I really feel like I can level the playing field there. But, even up to 50, 75, $100 million enterprise value, I'm not competing with the regional investment banks. Businesses up at that level, 100 million and up, maybe even 500 million and up now, the number keeps going up. The regional investment banks, Houlihan Lokey, Stephens, Raymond James, they need to make $1 million, $2 million success fee in order to take on that relationship. So there's a gap there. There's a gap between the business broker that's working Main Street and the investment banker who is working 100 million and up or 500 million and up transactions. So I feel like there's a nice void in that market that I can fill. There's certainly peers and competitors in that space, but it seems to be less populated. And there's an estimate that there are 300,000 businesses in the U.S. In that size range, the $10 to $100 million enterprise values. There's enough for me to make a good living and provide value to those sellers.
Lane, honestly, what you said there did not surprise me at all.
Yeah.
But I think it is a message that really needs to be put across to people. A lot of people go for the low end of the market. The effort in doing that low end of the market compared to doing the mid-market, it's far more work to do the low end than it is to do a single transaction in the mid-end. My experience has been in the vicinity of the 10, 9 and 8-digit deals. Now, right now, I'm doing 7-digit deals. There is a big difference between that. But what I'm doing is I'm rolling up those 30 of those 7-digit deals into a 10-digit deal. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. And
there's alchemy there, as you know.
Well, there is, but you said something before about cybersecurity, which really hit home. I did a job the beginning of last year, and it was at an aged care facility, 15 million. And that's Australian dollars, so probably about 150 US.
Yeah.
No, not really.
I don't know the exchange rate. You could have fooled me.
Okay. No, the exchange rate's about 64 cents to the dollar. So this was a good deal. However, it was an independent aged care facility. Got in there, did the due diligence, and of course the due diligence was totally screwed up by the time I got in there because they wanted to get the signature on the page because it was a good deal. It worked from a financial perspective. To hell with everything else. So get in there and start to actually do the real due diligence after we've already purchased the place. Yes, which is why deals fail. Find out that they've got a domestic internet service. They've got no firewall. Then the telephone system has its own direct internet access. No security whatsoever. It just goes straight out to the internet. And
There's
these
a risk
are the
there.
things that you find. Yeah, just a little. But these are the modern risks that we need to look into. And another thing that we did in that site was we got someone else in to do a building analysis so that we could put the Wi-Fi devices in the right spot as well. And that in itself is a modern risk, a modern thing that we have to do with days and going into organisations these days. So things aren't what they used to be. And the people that are doing, as you said, hundreds and thousands of deals may not necessarily be keeping up to date with these modern requirements.
I agree.
And it's so tough for the smaller people to do so.
Yeah, I've talked to some cybersecurity experts who are making a very good living consulting larger M&A deals, and they have indicated to me that they have seen situations where, and I've told you I'm a low-tech guy in a high-tech world, so I won't explain this in a technical way, but there are bad actors in the world that will implant basically something into a company's computer system when they're going through and then hold it for ransom, in the transaction. And So there's teams of people now that do nothing but go in and basically make sure that everything's clean. And again, it's not my area of expertise, but I know that it's an issue. It's an issue probably 10 years ago that we didn't have to worry about. But now it's very common to have a cybersecurity due diligence team as part of a transaction.
Also, last year, I did a carve out for an organization and we were just selling off one site. It was an asset purchase. They got the PCs, they got everything except for the data. Now, when you talk about cybersecurity there, the cybersecurity people had no processes and procedures in place to go and audit those PCs, to cleanse those PCs. And I'm there trying to negotiate with the buyer. And I said, okay, look, I said, this is simple. I said, we've got a contract in place. I said, we've got lawyers. I said, we're going to have to be honest with one another and be upfront with one another. And this is going to be a best effort, knowing that if there is data on those PCs and anything is misused in any way, of course, we're going to sue the living daylights out of you. And I said, provided we both understand that, let's keep moving forward, shall we?
Right. That didn't chase them away?
But no, in actual fact, that site went so well. Because I was leading the buyer by the nose the whole way through the transaction, because how many transactions do they do? Not many. How many have I done? Quite a few. So I was leading by the nose right the way through this. And I said, oh, by the way, those Wi-Fi devices, I said, I know you're going to put in other ones yourself. I said, can you just stick those in a box? And I said, I'll pick those up and take them back and sort them out later on. And also the computer routers and stuff and the firewall stuff, I said, I know you're going to put other stuff in place there. Just throw that in the same box and I'll sort it out for you, okay? They hired their own electrician to go in, disconnect all my stuff, which was their stuff because it was an asset purchase, stick it in a box out the front. I reversed the car up, threw it all in the boot. $263,000 worth of equipment.
Wow.
Purely because I had a relationship. I developed the relationship and worked with the buyer.
That's really,
and that's
it speaks
what can
to,
happen.
Yeah, well, that speaks to your ability to develop that relationship, because what I see quite often, Craig, particularly when I have a founder, owner, operator, and I've got a private equity firm, is there's a large measure of distrust on the part of the seller because they don't know what they don't know, and they've heard terrible things. They've heard the worst possible stories, right, about the institutional buyers of businesses. And, you know, when they get in over their head, if they're not properly advised, if they don't have someone with your knowledge and skill set involved, then, you know, they sort of assign the worst case, you know, to the buyer, and they become adversarial. And so that's a big part of my role, is trying to, you know, communicate what's standard and what, you know, how deals get done to help educate the seller so that they don't get adversarial with the buyer.
That is really the key. You've got to work with them and understand their position and what they're trying to achieve. And I literally said, we'll just sue the living daylights out of you. Now, that might sound adversarial, but it depends on how the relationship is, how you frame it as well. That was not taken anywhere near in an adversarial way at all. It was taken in okay, good, we've got that issue out of the way, now we can move forward.
And that happened because you had developed a trusting relationship with the seller.
Yes, and it
in the absence of that, that may have been interpreted differently if you hadn't done that. So there's a lesson to be learned there for buyers, is trying to understand sort of the emotional, you know, relationship with the seller as opposed to keeping it strictly financial, you know, where every deal term, every point becomes an argument and then the relationship breaks down.
I worked on a job, another carve-out / M&A, and it was a 10-digit deal, and there was a rather large penalty per month if this deal did not go through. That was negotiated, and it was a mistake. It should have been negotiated better. The reason why it was a mistake was because the penalty was so high, there was no incentive for the vendor to participate in the carve-out at all.
Right.
Had the penalty been lower, they would have been more motivated, or would have had some motivation to actually try and assist. There was no cooperation in that deal at all. It was adversarial all the way through, and attitude came from the very top.
You know, you know as well as I do, it's hard to get deals done. Firmex, a vendor in the M&A space, does an annual survey of lower middle market intermediaries such as myself. And I think their most recent survey data said that 25% of deals last year fell out between LOI and closing. So there's sort of this sense that once a letter of intent is in place between a buyer and a seller, it's all downhill. Boy, that's just the start of a marathon of due diligence to get to finish line. If a quarter or a third of deals fall out after an LOI, obviously they're not running deals the way you are. Now, there can be fraud, which I think is a very slight chance. You and I both know that sometimes buyers will try to retrade the agreement based on a quality of earnings analysis. They sort of use due diligence as a lever to come back and say, well, the business isn't what I thought it was. And sometimes they do that in good faith. They actually do find something that is inconsistent with the representations made, and they want to change. But it's hard to get deals done, and there are lots of problems along the way that come up that can kill a deal. Sounds like you've got a pretty good process for managing them, and a lot of it is that sort of emotional connection that you establish, that you develop a trusting relationship where they don't see you as an adversary.
I've got a question for you. I would like to know what your take would be on the difference between, and I don't know if you've even done this before, an expression of interest and an LOI, and where you would use the two and how.
Yeah, I would say that in the marketplace they're fairly fungible. I don't really see an LOI and an IOI as being expression of interest, indication of interest, as being terribly different in the initial stage. So I have two listings in market that I'm actively working right now, and I received indications of interest for each of them over the last couple of business days. And an indication of interest is typically a couple of pages long, 2, 3, maybe 4 pages, and it's fairly light on the granular details of the terms. And I want an indication of interest as an intermediary representing the seller. I just want to know what the intention and general, indication is of a buyer before I start introducing them to my client, letting them do deeper due diligence. Because as you know, there's some players in the market that don't have the ability to transact, and they will consume your time and energy. And it, certainly is
about 80% of them.
Yeah, and once you've had that experience a couple of times, particularly as an intermediary, when I've taken an unqualified buyer to my client and let them consume their time, only to have to reveal later in the process that they're not capable of buying your business, that'll teach you pretty quickly. So I use the indication of interest just as sort of table stakes, right? Can you get in the game here? And if you have an enterprise value in your head that's disconnected from where I think this business is going to transact, let's not waste each other's time with more detailed documents. And actually have 4 indications for one of the businesses, and 2 of them are just not actionable at all. Good qualified buyers, but where they're offering doesn't make any sense. So the way I see it is you go from a sort of skinny indication of interest that says, I'm going to put an enterprise value of $20 million on your business. I'm looking for a 10% equity roll. I want a seller note equal to 20% of the transaction. I'll pay the balance in cash. It's either the price is a multiple of EBITDA, or it's just an enterprise value that I'm showing you. Here are the terms and the light terms and conditions. Once I have those, I can sort of go to my seller and say, let's figure out which of these parties we're actually interested. One, is it an actionable indication? Is it worthy of us giving them more attention? And among the ones you've gotten, who do you favor as a potential buyer where you feel like there's a fit? So I just had a call before this podcast with a gentleman who submitted an indication of interest. It is right on target for where I told my client I thought he would transact. We looked at 27 comparable transactions in the private market for his sector, and literally the offer was within 200 basis points of the median multiple for businesses transacting in this space. It was right where we told him we thought he'd transact. It's a good quality buyer. And I said, we need to turn this, let me go talk to my client. And if we feel like this is actionable, which we will, then the next step is to go to an LOI. In the LOI, I want some additional clarity around the things that can blow a deal up if they're not addressed early on. as you know, don't want to treat an indication of interest or a letter of intent like a purchase agreement. You're not going to fully negotiate the deal in the LOI. You want to, I use the analogy, it's like getting engaged, right? I love you. I feel like I want to marry you. Let's get engaged. But between now and the altar, things can happen. So, you know, we feel like you're the right buyer. You've made a general offer that's a fit. You know, let's get into a letter of intent that gives you some period of exclusivity for us to see if this deal's going to go forward. The couple of things I really want to try to nail down as much as possible are working capital. I've had too many deals that die on the sword of working capital. And sellers have the mindset that, wait a minute, the cash and accounts receivable on my balance sheet, you know, net of my payables, that's mine. I made that money. I earned it. I paid taxes on it. That's my money. Why would I leave it behind for the buyer? The buyer says, hey, look, I'm not going to buy the car on your lot and drive it off without gas in the tank and oil. You know, that's not the way it works. It's got to be a working, functional piece of equipment. So the working capital, you know, depending on the industry and how intense how much capital is really required to run it, in a lower middle market deal, I've had working capital holdbacks $3, $4, $5 million. You know, you tell a seller that, hey, they're offering you $15 million, but you're going to leave $5 back in working capital in the business. I don't want to go under an LOI until we've gotten some clarity on that.
Do you do that based on finances, or did you do that based on time period, the amount of working capital required for a time period?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously a buyer wants as much working capital as they can argue for, and they will use the most liberal methodology to calculate that as possible. My sort of starting point is, look, you know, accounts receivable and the aging of accounts receivable, if it takes 60 days to collect receivables, and that funds the business, then we ought to leave back, you know, 60 days of cash or near cash in the business to fund that so that you can go collect the accounts receivable and keep the engine running. But sometimes, you know, a buyer will ask for a year, you know, of working capital. And I've just seen a lot of deals go sideways on it. And a lot of times it's because it's left until the purchase, you know, late in the purchase agreement negotiations. And all of a sudden you tell your seller, oh, by the way, you know, according to the purchase agreement, you're going to leave behind this amount of working capital. So if we're going to have a problem with that, I want to address it with my client on the front end. You know, again, I'm not going to try to negotiate for every penny, but I do want to have a general understanding of how do you define working capital and what's your expectation there. And let's at least put a general framework around it in the LOI. We don't have to nail down every term, but let's get an understanding.
And I think what we're seeing here in the way that you're talking is...
Go ahead, Craig.
But the way that you're talking here is you're educational. You're providing an understanding to the buyer as to what is required here. And you're educating them along the way. And that in itself goes a long way to a successful deal. Now,
it does.
With the working capital, you can also put in things like fine. We'll do that. You can have all that money back. That's fine. What we'll do is we'll put in an earn out after such and such a period. If that capital isn't being used or regained, then you can have that back. Certainly. A terminology that I often use is, that's great. We have a program for that. And then write it down. This is the issue. But whatever their issue is, fine. We've got a program for that. Write it down. We'll come back to you and work through that with you. You don't want to get into an argument. You don't want to get into a discussion on issues like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like your style because it sounds like, as opposed to approaching things where it's, you know, a win and lose situation, right? You want this, I want that. You're wrong, I'm right. You know, what the Harvard negotiating group would describe as positional bargaining. This is my position. Your position's wrong. One of us is going to win. One of us is going to lose, and everything's adversarial.
No.
Try to approach it from a different standpoint, which is tell me what you need and help me understand why you think this is the appropriate amount of working capital. I got to go talk to my client and try to explain to him why you want him to leave $4 million of cash and accounts receivable in the business when it only takes about $2 million of what we think is working capital to keep the business running. So, well, let's work together and try to figure this out. So that attitude of, look, okay, fine, I hear you. Let's try to figure this out.
You know, Lane, you're probably right. It is only going to take $2 million. But because I'm not as experienced as you with this, I need some security. And that's why I think we need to leave 4 million in there, and you'll get that other 2 million back pretty easily because you know the business better than I do. We'll just sort that out at a later date. So you'll get paid
I like
today, you'll
that.
get paid tomorrow.
Yeah, I like that. And I've seen it play out in all sorts of ways. I've had a deal recently where the buyer borrowed the working capital until the accounts receivable was collected, and then they paid it back to the seller, right? There's always a true up on working capital, where 90 days after closing, they do a calculation and they have the folks that did the quality of earnings analysis come back and analyze the working capital, and there's always a chance for that to get messed up. That's one of the issues. I just like to try to get some clarity in the LOI, just so there's a clear, significant difference between our expectations and theirs, that we at least are touching on that. If there's a seller note, I'd like to have a general understanding of how many years they expect that note to be outstanding and what sort of interest rate's going to be paid. Is it going to be collateralized? So I try to dance between the raindrops, Craig, of getting enough data to where I feel like the major issues that could blow this thing up, aside from something in due diligence that nobody expects, or the numbers we're providing are wrong, right? And the Q of E turns up something meaningful, or the business has a significant decline in performance during the due diligence period. I had a transaction that closed in February of this year, went under LOI in September of last year, but it had been under LOI earlier in the year. It was a commercial landscaping firm, and they had a record amount of rainfall in the geography where they performed work, and they were literally washed out in the first quarter. Their earnings and sales went down 50% while we were under LOI. So there's lots of things that can happen on the way to grandmama's house, right, to kill deals. I just want to try to mitigate the risk of the things that I know can be deal killers as early as possible in the transaction. And even if I say we don't have to really define this in the LOI, I will say, look, in the first stages of your due diligence, these are the things we need to tackle. Before you get into the Q of E, we need to figure these things out. Why spend $100,000 in due diligence as a buyer if we got a problem here that we know we need to address beforehand, just to see if we can go forward.
Okay, just a quick one before we should round this up, and that is, why spend $100,000? Now, what is your expectation of a percentage of the business for a due diligence, for an assessment, for the buy process? What sort of numbers do you look at?
I think it's very different for the buyer and the seller. So for my sellers, again, I'm dealing predominantly with founder, owner, operators who are selling to private equity. The private equity firms have investors, and they've got to show them that they know what they're doing, and they dotted their I's and crossed their T's. So I had a $16 million transaction last year where the buyer spent $100,000 in legal fees on a $16 million transaction. And that was just legal fees. That didn't include the quality of earnings analysis. It doesn't include any allocation of overhead to the team members they had working on that transaction. So I would say probably all in, they spent, $450,000 of direct and indirect cost on a $16 million transaction. Now, for my seller, if the buyers come into the table with a top tier law firm, yet we have to have reasonable representation to go toe to toe with them. But we're not going to spend anywhere near what they did. I think in that transaction where the buyer spent $300,000 on legal fees, we spent $100,000. I would say more typically it might be 50, to 75 in that size transaction. This one got a little tough because we had to keep responding to the big, white shoe law firm, that had 10 lawyers on the conference call that were beating us up. So, but I would like to think that my clients that are selling a $15 million, $20 million business can get out with under 100 to 125,000 in legal and accounting.
Good.
I'd prefer they do a front-end quality of earnings analysis as a sell side so that we can defend ourselves against the Q of E from the buy side. But, the best vendors I found that can do Q of E's well and at a reasonable price are $30,000 to $35,000. And it's kind of tough for that founder, owner, operator to look at my potential success fee and look at spending on the front end $35,000 to do a quality of earnings to present to a buyer. I may be too fee sensitive about my own fees myself. Maybe I should be a little more aggressive in defending them. But I'd love to have, I will say this, if you have the wrong legal representation, that can kill a deal as fast as anything. And one of the challenges in this lower middle market space is a founder, owner, operator who's got an attorney that did their will, their estate plan, that does some general corporate documents, but he's not a deal attorney, and they don't know what they don't know, and they're going to go up against deal attorneys that do nothing but deals all day long. And sometimes the egos get involved and they get territorial. If I can find a really good deal attorney, pretty much every time, right? But, there's a playing field of sort of generally accepted terms and conditions. You're going to get a 60-page purchase agreement. It's going to have 10 pages of reps and warranties. If you got a guy that writes wills, he's not going to understand what the playing field is, what the standards are for those reps and warranties. So he's going to come back with some unreasonable changes to the purchase agreement that aren't going to work for the buyer, and he can kill the deal for his seller because he's, I wouldn't get an estate plan done by, an attorney that's, does personal injury law. It's a specialty, and deal making is a specialty, and you need the right attorneys representing you who understand how the game works.
I think that is such a fantastic point to make, Lane. If you've got the wrong team behind you, and that, especially from a vendor's perspective, they've been long-term golf buddies and friends, and they just want to look after them. But they will kill the deal because they're not experienced, they're ignorant, and they're emotionally involved in the deal.
Yeah.
Whereas it should not be that way.
It's tough, I think, to be in over your head on something. It can be very intimidating. And, there's some really good law firms that do this all day, every day, and they've got really talented people, and it can get sideways pretty fast, in that sort of situation. And that's a big part of my role, is trying to help my client understand where the boundaries are. It's tough for a founder, owner, operator to get a 60-page agreement with 10 pages of reps and warranties and all sorts of legalese that they've never looked at before. It doesn't make any sense to them. And they're quick to attribute bad faith to the buyer. They're trying to screw me. I hear that all the time. They're trying to screw me with these documents. Well, maybe sometimes they are, right? And maybe some of these terms are unreasonable. They're outside the boundaries. But let's at least start with a frame of reference where we understand if these agreements are reasonable or they're unreasonable, and where we can push and pull, rather than just trying to attack the whole document and get crossways.
I'd love to keep chatting, Lane. I think that we could talk about, I'd love to go back to that expression of interest. Hello.
Yeah.
And work through those again from the opposite side of the table.
Yeah,
and
right.
I think that'd be a great discussion as well. But we must let our people go at this stage. Could you please give us a bit of a rundown on your podcast and give us some details on that, please? What it's about, how long you've been doing it, and the great people that you deal with, please.
Yeah, so the podcast is called The Deal Table. Thank you for asking. It started in the fall of last year. We've done 18 episodes at this point, and we film it in what's called the Pig Room on the campus of Old Parkland in Dallas. The Pig Room is a very unique visual space. Old Parkland is the haunt of Harlan Crow, the Trammell Crow fortune. It's his office compound. It looks like a college campus, and it's populated exclusively by private equity firms and family offices. So it's an ecosystem of people that are buying businesses, selling businesses, operating businesses, including some former U.S. presidents and some really high-profile private equity people. So it's a really special place. We're the only podcast that has permission to film on campus. And a number of our guests have come from the Old Parkland community itself. And generally speaking, they come from entrepreneurship and deal making. They are private equity investors. They have started, operated businesses. They've done roll-ups. They they're touching and feeling some part of the deal ecosystem, but it's an interestingly diverse kind of group of folks. I still don't know where we get all these people. There are a few of us involved in inviting guests, and we just seem to have 4 or 5 show up every month that offer great insights and perspectives. And I have fun doing it. It's enjoyable to sit down in conversations like this and shoot the breeze, particularly with very bright, engaging people. So it's on Spotify and YouTube and Apple and all the places where you go listen to podcasts. I won't pick my favorites because I would offend some of my other guests, but there's some particularly interesting folks that I think anybody would enjoy.
Well, thank you for that, Lane. Now, when we spoke, you asked me for my favorite podcast, the one that I
did,
have
yes.
done that was a bit
Yours
different.
was easy.
And I think I gave you Katrina PC008. I wonder how you went with that one, because that was certainly,
I Googled
when
it.
you talk about left field, it was in the next suburb.
Yeah. That was very exciting. I Googled it and, took me aback a little bit. And so I need to go watch the podcast. I think I started it and got busy, but I'm very interested in finishing that episode that you recorded.
Yes, it was certainly way out there, that one. Thank you so much, Lane. I really appreciate your time, taking time out from your family to do this today. I think that people really got an appreciation as to what you can do and how you can help them, the approach that you take. All your details will, as always, be at the end of this podcast. So just stick around a little bit longer, get access to Lane and make contact and exit with the greatest potential that you can. That's what we aim to do here, is give people the ability to be able to exit with the greatest potential. And obviously non-confrontational, which seems to have been a bit of a theme for this episode.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I really appreciate you having me on. I admire what you're doing. I look forward to making a trip down under to see how the world works in your environment. Sounds like there are a lot of similarities, and appreciate the effort you're making to educate people. The close rate really is 20% or so in the industry, and 8 out of 10 people that are trying to sell their business and create liquidity to fund their retirement aren't able to do that. There's a compelling need, and that's just terrible. I can't think of another industry that would operate with, imagine if the residential housing, that 80% of the people that tried to sell their house couldn't get a transaction or didn't get a transaction. It would be mayhem. And yes. We've got 1 million people in the U.S. a year that are retiring and trying to sell their business. And, I'd love for 1 million of them to get a transaction done. That would be great.
That is a devastating number. It really is. And we've got to do something about it. Thank you so much, Lane. Really appreciate you. And we will talk again.
Thank you so much.